let me go then to one of the other three principles of freedom, because one of the ways to keep government accountable is the freedom of the press. So there's the internet, and on the internet there's social networks, and one of them is called Twitter. I think you have an account there. People should follow you. And recently people have been throwing around for a while the words of freedom of speech. Uh, just out of curiosity, for tangent upon a tangent, what do you think of freedom of speech as it is today, and as it was at that time during the Civil War, after the Civil War, and throughout the history of America?
So freedom of speech has always been one of the core tenets of American democracy, and I'm near absolutist on it because I think that people should have the right to speak. What makes our democracy function is that there is always room for, quite frankly, people like you and me who like to disagree and have reasons to disagree. So I am against almost all forms of censorship. The only time I believe in censorship is if somehow an individual or a newspaper has stolen the Ukrainian plans for their next military movements in the next week.
Yeah.
You should not be able to publish that right now, maybe after they act. But
Yeah.
criticism, opinion, interpretation should be wide open. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you have the right to come to my classroom and start shouting and saying whatever you want.
Yeah.
You have the right on the street corner to do that. But my classroom is a classroom for my students with a particular purpose.
Yeah, sorry about that from last week. I'll never do it again. I apologize. I'm really sorry.
It's okay.
Never happened. Right. I get drunk and I get. So the people who don't know, you're a professor at UT Austin. It's nearby. So sometimes I get a little drunk and wander in there. I apologize.
You're not the only one. Was that you? I didn't even know it was you.
I'm sorry. Okay.
So the point is that free speech is not licensed to invade someone else's space, and I also believe in private enterprise. So I think that if I owned a social media network, I don't. It would be up to me to decide who gets to speak on that network and who doesn't, and then people could decide not to use it if they don't want to use it.
But there's so yes, that's one of the founding principles. So oftentimes when you talk about censorship, that's government censorship. So a social media, if you run a social media company, you should be able to decide from a technical perspective of what freedom of speech means. But there's some deeper ethical, philosophical sense of how do you create a world where every voice is heard, of the people, by the people, for the people. That's a complicated technical problem. When you have a public square, how do you have a productive conversation where critics aren't silenced, but at the same time, whoever has the bigger megaphone is not going to crowd out everybody else?
So I think it's very important to create rules of the game that give everyone a chance to get started, and that allow for guideposts to be created from the will of the community, which is to say that we as a community can say, we can't stop people from speaking, but we as a community can say that in certain forms, we're going to create certain rules for who gets to speak and who doesn't, under what terms, but they can still have somewhere else to go. So I believe in opening space for everyone, but creating certain spaces within those spaces that are designed for certain purposes. That's what a school does.
Mm-hmm.
So I will not bring someone to speak to my students who is unqualified. It's not a political judgment. The rules at a university are, we're an educational institution, you need to have the educational credentials to come speak about artificial intelligence. I'm not going to bring some bum off the street to do that, right? We have certain rules, but that bum on the street can still, in his own space or her own space, can still say what he or she wants to say about artificial intelligence. This is how newspapers work. When I write for the New York Times, they have an editorial team. The editorial team makes certain decisions. They check facts. And there's certain points of view. They don't allow anti-Semitic comments. Right? You're not going to be able to publish an anti-Semitic screed, whether you think it's true or not true, in the New York Times, but that doesn't prevent you from finding somewhere else. So we allow entities to create certain rules of the game. We make transparent what those rules are, and then we as citizens know where to go to get our information. What's been a problem the last few decades, I think, is it hasn't been clear what the rules are in different places and what are the legitimate places to get information and what are not.
Yeah, the transparency seems to be very critical there. Even for the New York Times, I think there's a lot of skepticism about which way the editorial processes lean. I mean, there's a public perception that it's, especially for opinions, it's going to be very left-leaning in the New York Times. And without transparency about what the process is like, about the people involved, all you do, like conspiracy theories and the general public opinion about that is going to go wild. And I think that's okay for the New York Times. People can, in a collective way, figure stuff out. Like they can say, okay, New York Times, 73% of the time is going to lean left. In their head, they have like a loose estimation or whatever. But for a platform like Twitter, it seems like it's more complicated. Now, of course, there should be rules of the game, but I think there's maybe I want to say a responsibility to also create incentives for people to do high effort, empathetic debate versus throwing poop at each other.
Yeah. I think those are two slightly different things, so I agree. I think that my view is that the failure of Facebook and Twitter and others in recent years has been that they have been completely untransparent about their rules. So what I would think would advance us is if they had a set of rules that were clear, that were consistently followed, and we understood what they were. That would also tell us as consumers what the biases are, how to understand what's going on. It seems, if I might say, that since Elon Musk has taken over Twitter, it's been arbitrary in who's thrown off and who's not thrown off, and that's a real problem. Arbitrariness is in some ways the opposite of democracy.
But there's also a hidden arbitrariness in interpretation of the rules. So, for example, what comment incites violence? That's really, really difficult to figure out to me. Like, there's a gray area. Obviously, there's very, very clear versions of that. But if I know anything about people that try to incite violence, they're usually not coming out and clearly saying it. They're usually kind of dog whistling it. And same with racism and anti-Semitism, all of that. It's usually dog whistles. Mm-hmm. So and they usually have fun playing with the rules, playing around the rules. So it's a gray area. Same with during COVID, misinformation. What's misinformation, right?
I agree. And some of these are age-old problems. Our legal system, common law, has been struggling with what is incitement to violence since the first Supreme Court decisions in the 18th century, right? So you're absolutely right. But I will say this. There are certain things that are clearly incitement to violence. I'll give you very clear examples. I'll just make it personal, right? My wife is an elected official here in Austin. There have been people who have put things up on Twitter calling for her to be hanged or calling for her to be attacked. That's incitement to violence. Yeah. When you specifically call for violence against someone, I agree. There's a lot of other stuff where it's a gray area, but we could start, if we're applying these rules, by getting that material off of these sites.
So some of that is a problem of scale too, but the gray area is still a forever problem that we may never be able to solve, and maybe the tension within the gray area is the very process of democracy. But saying like we need to take our country back. Is that incitement of violence?
I don't think that. I think we need to take our country back. Just that? No.
But then,
because I might say that. I might say we need to take our...
I say that all the time. I go, again, I walk around drunk just screaming that at everybody.
I thought you wanted us to take you back.
Exactly. I was very confused. My messaging needs to work.
But let's go to the January 6th example, right? To say hang Mike Pence, that's incitement to violence.
Yeah.
To say go get Nancy, that's incitement to violence.
Yeah, it's very clear. I don't think that's the big problem. The big problem is the gray area. But yet, and the other problem is just how to technically find the large scale of comments and posts and so on that are doing this kind of clear
something for you to solve. You're the
I understand.
I mean, don't ask me those questions.
Well, I have to say, some of that is motivation, some of that is vision, and some of that is execution.
Yes.
So, for example, just to go out briefly on a dark topic, something I've recently became aware of is Facebook and Twitter and so on. People post violence on there, like like videos of violence, child porn, some of the darkest things in this world. And to find them at scale is a difficult problem. And to act on it aggressively is a difficult problem. But I think part of this motivation, like saying this is a big problem. We need to take this on. We need to find all the darkest aspects of human nature that rise and appear on our platform and remove them, so that we can create a place for humanity to flourish through the process of conversation. But it's just hard. It's just really hard when you look at like millions of posts, trillions of interactions. It's wild. What's like the amount of data.
But where we are now with social media seemed wild and impossible 5 years ago, right?
Yes.
I actually, what frustrates me is I think there are people who have politicized this issue in unnecessary ways. Everyone, regardless of their politics, should support what you just said. Investing our money, maybe grants from the federal government, in AI skilled people like you figuring out ways to get violent videos off of there. That shouldn't be political.
Well, some of that also requires being transparent from a social media company perspective, and transparent in a way that really resists being political. To be able to be transparent about your fight against these evils while still not succumbing to the sort of the political narratives of it. That's tricky, but you have to do that kind of and like walk calmly through the fire, because that's what Twitter feels like if you're being political. It's like a firing squad from every side, and you, as a leader, you have to kind of walk calmly.
Right, and that is where we need a new generation of people who will have diverse politics, but will stand up against that, right? I mean, that's the lesson from after the Civil War is where progress is made. The war doesn't solve problems of hate. Where progress is made is where you have local leaders and others who stand up and say, we can differ, but we're going to stop calling people from certain backgrounds monkeys, which was a common thing to do at that time. Jews are still called monkeys in certain places, right? People have to stand up while still maintaining their political differences.